Hello, thank you. Welcome to Geoeconomic Insights. I'm Andrew Capistrano, visiting research fellow at the Institute of Geoeconomics, and I'm joined by our director, Professor Kazuto Suzuki, to discuss our recent trip to Helsinki Geoeconomics Week, which was just this past week in Helsinki, Finland. So, Professor Suzuki, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Let's just start off by going over some of the interesting, I thought, distinctions between Japan's approach to geoeconomics and economic security versus what it seems like the Europeans and the European Commission have in mind based on the discussions at the conference.
Well, I think there's certain differences between the European Union and Japan. Especially European Union, first of all, is a very complex entity. It has the European Commission, and then the member states, and then industry. Whereas in Japan, there's a straightforward government and industry structure. So I think there's difficulties in European Union to formulate the simple, straightforward European strategy, which transcends from the European Commission to the industry altogether. Member states, 27 of them, have different interests, and also there are a number of the ways in which that the member states interact with its industry. So it makes it very difficult for them to configure what is the final objective, for example, to reject or to increase its engagement with China for the economic benefits, or to reduce the dependency on China, or somewhat in a different ways. The second major differences is that European Union has more consciousness about the American economic strategies or the geoeconomic strategy. For example, the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, has a significant impact on the European automobile industry. Also, the CHIPS Act, the European Union also has its own CHIPS Act, which is directly reflecting as a competition with the United States CHIPS Act. So I think there are much less concerns about the security threat of China than the threat of being manipulated by the US regulations. The third difference is perhaps the different perception, the threat perception between Japan and the EU on China. For European Union, still there are a very strong interest in investing and operating within Chinese market, and there's a very strong dependency on that. So I think the ways in which that the Japan and the European Union considers the geoeconomics or economic security policies quite differently, and I think there are certain commonalities, whereas that we need to build up more resilient supply chain, particularly with critical minerals or basic technologies. Also, there is a lot of room for more cooperation on the emerging technologies such as AI. But still, I think there is a fundamental difference between Japan and the EU.
Yes, I know. I got that approach too. The similar sort of impression that perhaps it came up in some of the discussions that for the European Union, the emphasis remains on economic security. And despite the name of the conference, geoeconomics is not necessarily the operating idea or the operating narrative behind their policy formulation. And I wonder if there are more direct opportunities for Japan and the EU to cooperate, or perhaps there are some ways that member states can learn from Japan's approach.
Well, I think there are, despite the differences, I think there are a lot of things that Europe can learn from Japan. First of all, I think this strategic dialogue between the government and industry, although, as I said, there are complex governance mechanisms in Europe, still, I think there is a necessity for the major Europe-wide industries, such as the automobile industry, the electronics, etc., needs to have more direct communication between the European Commission and the industry representatives. The second, I think, the commonalities or the lessons that Europe can learn is that the change of the narratives of the ways in which that the management is responsible for the economic security. I think one of the problem in Europe is that there are a number of individuals, the person who is responsible for the risk management or the consultancy firms that is dealing in very detail about economic security. But when it comes to the management level, I think there are much less awareness of such a risks, and I think the weight of the risk is much smaller in the European context. And of course, because of the different corporate cultures and different ways of management. And I think Japan has a very unique management style, namely, those people who are in the the management board are those people who are grown up from the bottom up, whereas in Europe there are much more professional managers. But these professional managers tend to have much shorter vision of their interest and not really seeing the long-term risks. So I think to that extent, European companies can learn from the Japanese practices.
And that brings up, another interesting point that got raised. I mean, this has been raised in the context of the U.S. as well. But the government economic security policies will often attempt to, the word would be weaponize the intellectual property of their private sector firms. And this, of course, will affect their ability to do business, their profit margin. And this distinction between the government interest and the private interest came up repeatedly, but also in the context of the European Union, the European Commission's interest versus the national interests of individual countries. This I felt was a major takeaway, and I was wondering if you have any thoughts on this.
Well, I fully agree with that. I think there are certain sort of a trilateral way of the strategic dialogue necessary in European Union context. The European Commission, member states, and the industry needs to talk to each other in the European-wide context. Because, there are 27 representatives. That is already complicated enough. But there are a number of the major industry which are relative to the economic security, particularly the strategic field. So I think what is necessary in Europe is to have more consolidation of those countries and the industry which are responsible and which represents the interest as an aggregate, because I think there is one successful example in the past is the European Industrial Roundtable, which took place in 1980s to promote the idea of further European integration, which leads to the Single European Act. So this was the time that there were, of course, the member states were only 12 countries, so it's much less complex. But still, there were multiple industry, multiple member states involved in the sort of a roundtable discussion. And I think that there are certain leadership by the Commission. Etienne Davignon from Belgium was the leading figure to promote this idea of roundtable. And this sort of a historical past, the Europe can learn itself from its own past.
Yes, no, I agree. And one of the interesting things was, of course, China was hanging over these discussions. Much very thankful that the conference organizers managed to bring people from 70 countries there, and there was a lot of Japanese representation, but only one Chinese guy. And one thing that I noticed was that China has only really become on the horizon for European economic security quite recently. And one thing I hadn't fully anticipated was the degree to which the Ukraine war and China's support of Russia has kind of brought China further into focus, at least at the European Commission level. Finland being right next to Russia, you could feel the pressure of Ukraine throughout the whole discussions. And this is something that maybe is missing from the Japan side of the discussion. I'm wondering if you think anything significant can be done to address China and Russia from Asia and Europe, two regions quite directly, quite far apart, but nevertheless facing a similar challenge.
Well, of course, I think this is we are facing the similar challenge. Both Europe and Japan are neighbor to Russia, and also having the impact of the Chinese relationship with Russia in various ways. But I think the way in which that the Europe feel pressure from Russia is because there is a direct the military activities that is facing towards Europe, and if Ukraine falls, then the Poland or Baltic states may be the next. So there is a significant concerns about these Russian capabilities with how China is supporting the build-up of or maintaining the Russian capabilities. However, I think Japan, which is not facing the sort of an immediate threat of the Russian invasion, I think these concerns are quite different, and I think it's not surprising. It's not unusual. I think it is reasonably understandable, but I think it is necessary that we need to understand the impact of the Chinese support of Russia. However, the problem is that how can we stop them? I think there are very limited policy tools that we can influence the bilateral trade relationship between China and Russia. We cannot, of course, we can encourage China to join the framework of sanctions, but I don't think that China will ever be joining the Russian sanctions against Russia. So I think what we can do is to impose the secondary sanctions on China, which is the companies which traded with Russia or banks that has assisted the trade between China and Russia needs to be sanctioned against needs to be sanctioned by those activities. And the way in which that the sanctions work is that to exclude those companies and banks which are related and traded with Russia to get access to the Western market. For example, the U.S. financial market is the largest and powerful one, but also the European market, the European Union, is also a very large enough market for the Chinese companies to export to, and so was Japanese market. So I think these exercise of the secondary sanctions against the Chinese companies and banks will be the major approach to influence the behavior, and to a certain extent, the United States is selectively applying these secondary sanctions against Chinese companies and banks, so that gradually the Chinese banks are stopping the financial assistance to Russia or the assisting the trade with Russia. So I think this is in Helsinki Geoeconomics Weeks there are couple times that this issue has brought up in the panel, and I think it was useful idea to have the sort of a consolidation of the Western alliance to enforce these and to effectively work these secondary sanctions.
Yeah, I think that your point about the consolidation of the Western Alliance is really apt. Another thing that I thought was quite useful about the conference was the way they structured the panels, meaning that different sectors got to kind of come together to discuss different issues. You know, for example, they had a panel of academics discussing how teaching geoeconomics could be used in universities. They had panels of investors, panels of corporate planners who are on the industrial side. And you got to see, you know, there was some exchange and there was some differences, but you got to see, I think, a fair amount of convergence around certain definitions of geoeconomics, certain approaches. You know, one thing that I thought was interesting was the industrial companies see economic security as a major deal. They see Europe is kind of struggling to create an industrial policy that will match what's being done in China and the United States. But then investors did not necessarily see geoeconomic risk as something that had much effect on the market, meaning that it's essentially priced in and that the markets will recover even after major shocks like the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So I guess, you know, as we draw this closer to the end, perhaps you could comment on some of these panels and some of the distinctions between the different interest groups that are approaching geoeconomics, perhaps from different standpoints.
Well, I think it is interesting. First of all, this Geoeconomic Week has a very interesting structure of focusing on these academics, investors, or the industrialists or governments, and I think it was meaningful distinction, and I think it was an interesting attempt to engage into a more strategic dialogue between these different sectors and different functions. I agree that the investors in Europe were less concerned about geoeconomics, but they are more concerned about the geopolitics. And I think it was more short-term impact that has in the market, and particularly the financial market. And I think it was very interesting to see the academics also disagreeing about the methods and the definition, particularly those who are teaching in the economic side and the legal issues and the political sciences. So I think different countries, different disciplines have different ideas. So I think there are a lot more work needs to be done. And I think the concept of geoeconomics or economic security needs to be more elaborated and also being shared by the relevant stakeholders, including the academics. I think one thing that, from my point of view, one thing that is missing in the Helsinki Geoeconomics Week was the paying more attention to the different national interest or national strategies. I think there are thematic panels. There are panels composed by the different by different sectors. But I think there are not much divergence of the regional or the national approaches. I think there are certain differences of the national policies, and I think it is also interesting to see a lot of differences between the US participants and the European participants and the Japanese participants. So there are. I think it would be better to have the sort of the national, comparative national studies and comparative sectoral studies, so that we can have more, wider view of how we see the differences across sectors and across the countries. and to see, where there might be a convergence of the different ideas and different interests of the sectors, and the states.
Yeah, I think that's quite a good point. And in fact, it was raised at the very final lunch in the idea planning session for what next year's Helsinki Geoeconomics Week could entail. The idea of holding more regional panels to discuss some of these regional differences, I think, could really help to flesh out the discussion. So before we close, if you have any other final thoughts about the conference, we of course would just like to give thanks to the main organizer Jens Hildebrand Pohl from the Finnish Institute of International Affairs and his colleagues, Mikael, Edward, and others, for the invitation for a very interesting and insightful conference that I thought brought together a diverse group of people. So any final thoughts?
Well, I think we as an Institute of Geoeconomics planning to do more some sort of a similar event, although we are not trying to do it as for a whole week. Although, the August in Helsinki was very good. I mean, we can escape the heat in Tokyo, but we are primarily trying to do what Institute of Geoeconomics is trying to do is that we are trying to build up more regional aspect of the geoeconomics, namely the Asia Pacific or Indo Pacific approach. I think, as I said, there are regional differences, and I think it would be a little bit of too complicated if we just brought everything into one place. So probably what is required, and I think Helsinki Geoeconomics Week was more or less European affairs, and I think what we can do is that we can do more Asia Pacific oriented ones. So, I think these efforts of creating the regional forum will be, and of course will invite the not non-Asia Pacific participants and audiences as well. But I think these region oriented planning or gathering is will be very useful in terms of more better understanding of how different regions, different countries approach differently to the question of economic security, and namely the way in which that the United States and China has an influence in the global market.
Yes, I agree with that. Definitely looking forward to the Institute of Geoeconomics Summit coming this fall. So once again, for Geoeconomic Insights, I'm Andrew Capistrano. Thank you, Professor Suzuki, for joining us. And again, thank you to the Finnish Institute of International Affairs and Helsinki Geoeconomics Week for the invitation. We'll see you next time.
Thank you.
But does it really rise to the level of a triangle, like not just two poles, but a three-way nexus? It sounds a little bit like a distinction without a difference, because I think a lot of people would say that the European Union is almost just an appendage of the United States.